Lisa Patterson's life in Maplewood seemed like a scene straight out of a glossy magazine. Her days were filled with the warmth of her classroom, the joy of her daughter's laughter, and the stability of her comfortable home. The well-maintained house on Elm Street was surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and vibrant flower beds, emblematic of the serene suburban lifestyle she embraced. Lisa had crafted an image of perfection, one that was not just for show but genuinely meaningful to her, despite the simmering dissatisfaction she felt. Lisa's husband, Mark, was the quintessential provider. His career as an executive brought in a steady income, and their social life was marked by gatherings and charity events where they were always the picture of success. Mark's charm and affability made him a favorite at community functions, and his apparent dedication to his family was both admired and envied. Yet, beneath the surface of their seemingly perfect life, there was an undercurrent of discontent. Lisa had always been an optimistic person, but recently, the cracks in her marital bliss had become harder to ignore. Mark's once enthusiastic affection had waned, replaced by distant looks and absent-mindedness. He was frequently caught up in his work, leaving Lisa feeling isolated and unfulfilled. The routine of their daily life had begun to weigh heavily on her, and the spark that once ignited their relationship now felt like a distant memory. One crisp autumn afternoon, Lisa was tidying up the living room while Emily played with her toys in the adjacent playroom. The gentle hum of the vacuum cleaner filled the room as Lisa dusted the bookshelf. She paused for a moment, glancing at a family photo on the wall. A snapshot of a happier time. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden chime of her phone. It was a message notification from Mark's phone, which had been left on the kitchen counter. Curiosity piqued. Lisa picked up the phone and saw a text message from a number she did not recognize. The message was affectionate and intimate, with phrases that seemed far too personal for a casual acquaintance. Lisa's heart raced as she read the words, realizing that Mark had been exchanging messages with someone who was not her. Her breath caught in her throat, and a cold wave of dread washed over her. Lisa's mind raced with questions. Who was this person? What was the nature of their relationship? The text messages were filled with terms of endearment and promises of future meetings. Each word seemed to erode the stability she had clung to for so long. Her hands shook as she placed the phone back on the counter, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Later that evening, Lisa confronted Mark about the messages. They were sitting at the dinner table, their meal untouched as Lisa broached the subject. Mark's initial reaction was one of confusion, quickly followed by defensiveness. He assured Lisa that the messages were from a business contact and that there was nothing to worry about. His calm demeanor only served to heighten Lisa's anxiety. The more Mark tried to explain, the more Lisa felt the chasm between them growing. The following days were filled with tension and unspoken words. Lisa's suspicion had taken root, and she found herself obsessing over every detail of Mark's behavior. The small discrepancies and unexplained absences that once seemed inconsequential now loomed large in her mind. She discovered a second phone hidden in Mark's desk drawer, further fueling her doubts. Determined to uncover the truth, Lisa decided to investigate further. Her search led her to online directories and social media platforms, where she eventually traced the phone number to a woman named Sophie Richards. The name was unfamiliar to Lisa, but the location, Charleston, South Carolina, was a clue that pointed to something beyond their usual boundaries. Lisa's frustration and fear mounted as she pieced together fragments of information. She found that Mark had been traveling to Charleston more frequently than he had admitted. The notion that he had a second life, with someone else entirely, was a painful revelation. Lisa's sense of betrayal was profound, and she felt as though her entire world had been upended. On one particularly bleak afternoon, Lisa sat in her car outside their home, staring at the house that had once symbolized her ideal life. The reality of Mark's deceit and her own growing paranoia weighed heavily on her. The picturesque facade of their home seemed like a cruel joke, masking the turmoil within. The catalyst for Lisa's impending confrontation with Mark's secret life came unexpectedly. She received an anonymous letter detailing Mark's double life, including his visits to Charleston and his relationship with Sophie. The letter confirmed her worst fears and provided her with an address where she could find Sophie. The gravity of the situation struck Lisa hard. The serene suburban existence she had cherished was disintegrating, replaced by a harsh reality she could scarcely comprehend. Lisa's resolve hardened. She knew she had to confront Mark and Sophie, though the prospect filled her with dread. The illusion of her perfect life had been shattered, and the weight of the truth was almost unbearable. Little did she know that the confrontation would set off a chain of events that would change her life for forever. As the days passed, Lisa Patterson's sense of betrayal grew more consuming. The anonymous letter she had received left no room for doubt. Mark had been living a double life, and Sophie Richards was central to his deceit. The facade of normalcy in Lisa's life had been obliterated, replaced by an all-consuming obsession with uncovering the full extent of Mark's infidelity. The discovery that Mark was maintaining a secret family in Charleston, South Carolina, weighed heavily on her, fueling a mix of jealousy, paranoia, and anger. Lisa's days became a blur of anxious thoughts and sleepless nights. She would lay awake, replaying the messages she had read and the unsettling phone conversations Mark had had in the past. Each detail seemed to confirm her worst fears and drive her further into a spiral of distrust. She found herself scrutinizing every interaction Mark had, looking for signs of further deceit. Mark, oblivious to the depth of Lisa's suspicions, continued his routine with increasing nonchalance. He would often come home late, claiming work commitments or business meetings. These excuses, once plausible, now seemed like transparent lies to Lisa. Her mind raced as she wondered what he was hiding and what he had told Sophie about her. The emotional toll of the situation was evident. Lisa's once vibrant demeanor became shadowed by a persistent sense of betrayal. One evening, Lisa's growing paranoia reached a peak. She had followed Mark under the pretense of running an errand and saw him leaving the office later than usual. Her heart pounded as she trailed him, her anxiety mounting with each mile. They drove away from home. Mark's destination was an unremarkable, nondescript hotel on the outskirts of town. Lisa watched from a distance, her mind racing with the implications of his actions. Her suspicion turned into near certainty when she saw him enter the hotel, carrying a briefcase that looked suspiciously out of place. Lisa's breath quickened as she debated whether to follow him inside or wait. She decided to wait, her mind a chaotic whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. After what felt like an eternity, Mark emerged from the hotel an hour later, looking agitated but trying to maintain his composure. Lisa's confrontation with Mark that evening was fraught with tension. She confronted him about his late-night activities, her voice trembling with emotion. Mark, caught off guard, attempted to placate her with a combination of anger and defensiveness. He insisted that his late nights were due to work projects and meetings, but Lisa could see the cracks in his story. Her accusations were met with a mixture of denials and accusations of her own jealousy. Despite Mark's insistence, Lisa's doubts persisted. She couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something more significant. Her next step was to investigate further. Lisa began to secretly gather information about Sophie. She reached out to old friends and acquaintances in Charleston, trying to piece together Sophie's life and the extent of her relationship with Mark. Lisa's investigation led her to a series of unsettling discoveries. She learned about Sophie's financial struggles and her single-parent status, which only deepened Lisa's sense of unfairness. Mark's ability to compartmentalize his life was extraordinary. He had managed to keep his two worlds completely separate. Sophie's background painted a picture of vulnerability and desperation, making the situation even more complicated for Lisa. Despite the distance, Lisa's emotional turmoil made her feel as if Sophie was living right next door. Her jealousy and anger grew as she imagined Mark's interactions with Sophie. She found herself obsessively checking social media profiles and online posts related to Charleston, hoping to find any clue that would validate her suspicions. One weekend, Lisa decided to take a more direct approach. She drove to Charleston, using the address from the anonymous letter as her guide. The city was vibrant and bustling, a stark contrast to the oppressive mood that had settled over Lisa. Her visit was fueled by a mix of hope and dread. She wanted to confront Sophie but feared the consequences of her actions. Lisa's first attempt to find Sophie was met with disappointment. She visited the address listed in the letter, only to discover that it was an old office building that had recently been converted into luxury apartments. The search led her to various locations, but Sophie was nowhere to be found. Frustration mounted as Lisa's efforts seemed to go in vain. The breakthrough came when Lisa discovered Sophie's workplace, the modest cafe in the heart of Charleston. The cafe was cozy and unassuming, a stark contrast to the polished life that Mark portrayed. Lisa decided to visit the cafe under the guise of a tourist, hoping to gather more information about Sophie. Her visit to the cafe was nerve-wracking. Lisa observed Sophie from a distance, noting her demeanor and interactions with customers. The sight of Sophie, working diligently and interacting with patrons with a mix of friendliness and fatigue, only heightened Lisa's sense of injustice. She felt a pang of sympathy for Sophie, but it was quickly overshadowed by her rage and betrayal. Lisa's investigation also revealed that Mark had been in frequent contact with Sophie, often sending her money and gifts. The evidence of Mark's financial support for Sophie only fueled Lisa's anger. She began to entertain the idea of a confrontation, driven by a need to reveal the truth and reclaim some semblance of control over her life. As Lisa prepared for the confrontation, her paranoia and jealousy reached new heights. She began to suspect that Mark was planning to leave her for Sophie. Every phone call, every text message seemed to be a part of a grand deception. Her fears were exacerbated when she noticed a change in Mark's behavior. He was more irritable and less attentive, further deepening her sense of betrayal. Lisa decided to confront Mark and Sophie together. She arranged a meeting under the pretense of discussing a work-related matter, hoping to catch them off guard. The meeting was set for a weekend evening, a time when Mark's work schedule would be less predictable. The confrontation was fraught with tension. Lisa arrived at the cafe, her heart pounding in her chest. She spotted Mark and Sophie at a corner table, engaged in a seemingly innocent conversation. As she approached, her emotions were a volatile mix of anger and desperation. Mark and Sophie looked up in surprise as Lisa confronted them. The cafe's atmosphere seemed to freeze as Lisa's voice rang out, accusing Mark of betrayal and deceit. The confrontation quickly escalated into a heated argument. Sophie, caught off guard, was visibly distressed as the truth about her relationship with Mark was laid bare. The argument drew the attention of other patrons, who watched with growing concern. Lisa's confrontation reached a boiling point when she accused Mark of ruining her life and the lives of those around him. Mark, defensive and angry, tried to deflect blame, but the damage was done. The public nature of the confrontation made it clear that their secrets were no longer safe. The emotional intensity of the confrontation left Lisa feeling emotionally drained and conflicted. She had succeeded in exposing the truth, but at the cost of her own emotional stability and sense of control. The confrontation with Mark and Sophie marked a turning point in Lisa's journey, setting the stage for the unraveling of her carefully constructed world. As Lisa left the cafe, her mind was filled with a mix of triumph and despair. The confrontation had revealed the extent of Mark's deceit, but it had also left her grappling with the harsh reality of her situation. The illusion of a perfect life had been shattered, and the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges. The emotional fallout from the confrontation would have far-reaching consequences, setting the stage for the dramatic events to come. The confrontation at the cafe had left Lisa Patterson in a state of emotional turmoil. The truth about Mark's double life was now out in the open, but the clarity she had sought brought with it a new wave of chaos and despair. Lisa had felt a strange sense of catharsis in exposing Mark and Sophie's relationship, but the fallout was more intense than she had anticipated. Her confrontation had not only humiliated Mark, but also put Sophie in an extremely vulnerable position. With a mixture of triumph and dread, Lisa returned to Maplewood, her mind racing with the implications of what had happened. Her confrontation had not ended the way she had hoped. Mark had been furious and defensive, and Sophie had been left in a state of panic. Lisa's own emotions were a chaotic blend of anger, guilt, and a desire for resolution. The following days were fraught with tension and uncertainty. Mark's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He was distant and short-tempered, and his attempts to salvage their fractured marriage seemed half-hearted at best. Lisa felt like a spectator in her own life, watching as the threads of her once secure existence unraveled. The confrontation had set off a series of events that neither she nor Mark could control. One cold, rainy night, Lisa's internal conflict reached a breaking point. She decided to confront Mark and Sophie one last time. She wanted answers, and she needed closure. Lisa's anxiety was palpable as she drove back to Charleston, where she knew Mark would be spending the night with Sophie. The drive was a blur of rain-soaked roads and dark thoughts, and Lisa's resolve hardened with each mile. Arriving at the apartment complex where Sophie lived, Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. The rain had intensified, turning the streets into a slick, reflective mess. Lisa parked her car a few blocks away, not wanting to attract attention. She approached the building cautiously, her nerves on edge. The prospect of seeing Mark and Sophie together once more filled her with a sense of dread and determination. Lisa managed to gain entry into the building using a key she had obtained through a contact. She climbed the stairs to Sophie's apartment, each step echoing in the silent corridor. The sound of muffled voices from inside the apartment grew louder as she approached. Lisa's hands trembled as she reached for the door, her emotions a volatile mix of anger and fear. The confrontation began as Lisa entered the apartment unannounced. Mark and Sophie were seated on the couch, engaged in an intimate conversation. Their faces registered shock and confusion as Lisa stormed in. The apartment was dimly lit, casting long shadows that seemed to heighten the tension of the moment. "What are you doing here?" Mark demanded, his voice a mix of irritation and fear. Sophie looked between Lisa and Mark, her expression a mix of panic and guilt. Lisa's voice trembled with rage as she accused Mark of ruining her life and betraying both her and Sophie. The argument quickly escalated, with voices raised and tempers flaring. The emotional intensity of the confrontation was palpable, each person's frustration and anger fueling the heated exchange. In the midst of the argument, Lisa noticed a large, heavy lamp on a nearby table. The lamp had always seemed out of place in Sophie's otherwise modest apartment. It was a potential weapon, and Lisa's mind, already fraught with emotion, fixated on it as a symbol of her own anger and desperation. Mark and Lisa's argument grew more chaotic, with accusations flying back and forth. Sophie, in an attempt to defuse the situation, tried to intervene, but her efforts only seemed to heighten the tension. Lisa's anger boiled over, and in a moment of uncontrolled rage, she grabbed the lamp and swung it toward Mark. The swing was wild and uncontrolled, fueled by a surge of adrenaline and frustration. The lamp struck Mark with a sickening thud, sending him crashing to the floor. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she watched Mark fall, his face contorted in pain and shock. The apartment fell silent, save for the sound of Mark's labored breathing and the rain pounding against the windows. Sophie screamed, her voice piercing the tense silence. Lisa's own shock and horror quickly replaced her anger as she realized the gravity of what she had done. Mark lay motionless on the floor, blood pooling around him. Lisa's mind raced as she struggled to process the unintended violence she had just unleashed. Panic set in as Lisa and Sophie stood over Mark's prone body. Sophie's initial shock gave way to frantic action as she called for emergency services. Lisa, overcome by a sense of guilt and fear, fled the scene, leaving Sophie to deal with the aftermath. Lisa's flight from the apartment was hasty and disorganized. She drove back to Maplewood in a daze, her mind overwhelmed by the realization of what she had done. The weight of the situation pressed heavily on her, and her guilt was compounded by the knowledge that Mark's death was a direct result of her own uncontrollable rage. The next few days were a whirlwind of legal and emotional turmoil. The police investigation into Mark's death quickly uncovered Lisa's involvement. Sophie's testimony painted a clear picture of the confrontation and Lisa's role in the tragic incident. The evidence against Lisa was damning, with the lamp bearing traces of her fingerprints and the apartment showing signs of a violent struggle. The trial was a media sensation, drawing attention from both local and national news outlets. Lisa's emotional state was laid bare for all to see, and the courtroom drama was filled with moments of intense emotion and legal wrangling. The prosecution painted Lisa as a jealous and irrational woman who had allowed her emotions to spiral out of control. Lisa's defense team argued that the act was an unintended consequence of a heated argument, and that Lisa's actions, while tragic, were not premeditated. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury found Lisa guilty of manslaughter. The verdict was a harsh reminder of the consequences of unchecked emotions and the devastating impact they could have on the lives of others. Lisa was sentenced to a substantial prison term, a consequence of her actions and the resulting loss of a life.